On the 25th of July, 7 names came out of the Holy See press office in a single line of text. No press conference, no announcement from the balcony. 7 names on a bulletin, the way Rome has done it for centuries, and then the working day carried on. America looked at one of them. The name was Salvatore Cordileone, Archbishop of San Francisco. And if that name means anything to you at all, it almost certainly means one thing. He is the man who, in May of 2022, told the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States that she could not receive Holy Communion in his archdiocese. Pope Leo XIV has just placed that man on the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura, the highest court in the Catholic Church, the last place a case can go before it reaches the Pope himself. Fox News ran it, the Christian Post ran it, Blaze Media ran it. And every one of them ran it with more or less the same headline, word for word. The Pope promotes the Archbishop who denied Pelosi communion. They are not wrong. He did, and the Pope did. That is the news. It is real, and I am not going to spend 40 minutes pretending it is something else. But I want to tell you something now, at the beginning, instead of saving it for the end, because I think you deserve to know what kind of conversation this is going to be. There were 7 names on that bulletin. America looked at one. And the one America looked at is not the one that changes the church. So here is what I am going to give you, and I am going to tell you when each piece arrives, so you can hold me to it. First, I am going to tell you exactly what Cordileone did in 2022, what he did before it that almost nobody reported, and what Rome did to him 5 weeks later. Second, I am going to show you a door that has been standing open inside the Catholic Church for 18 years, that 2 popes walked past without touching. Third, and this is the one I would stay for, I am going to give you the name on that list that changes more than Cordileone's name ever will, and it is a name you have never heard in your life. 3 things. I will flag each one when we get there. And if you leave before the third, you will have heard the story that every news channel in America already told you, and you will have missed the story underneath it. Now, before I take you into any of it, you should know who is talking to you, because it matters for this particular story more than most. I am a Catholic priest. I spent 30 years inside this church, most of them on the south side of Chicago, in parishes where the boiler broke every winter and the collection never covered it. And somewhere in the middle of those 30 years, I saw something being quietly buried, and I said so out loud. I want to be careful about how I put this, because I am not here to relitigate my own life on your time. But nobody argued with what I said. That is the part I still think about. Nobody sat me down and told me I was wrong about the facts. They simply decided that the problem was me, and they handled the problem, and the thing I had named went on exactly as it was. I tell you that for one reason. When I read a story about who is allowed to judge inside the Catholic Church, and about what happens to a churchman who enforces a rule that powerful people would rather he did not enforce, I am not reading a story about procedure. I know what that room feels like. Let me take you back to 2022. Here is the part that most of the coverage skipped, then and now. It did not begin in May. It began in April, privately, and it began with a warning. According to the Archdiocese's own public account of it, Cordileone had told the speaker directly, before any of this became a headline, that she had 2 options. She could repudiate her position on abortion, or she could stop invoking her Catholic faith as the justification for that position. Not both. Either one. Change the position, or stop using the church as the reason for it. She did neither. And on the 20th of May, 2022, Cordileone did something that American bishops had been avoiding for the better part of 20 years. He put it in writing, and he made the writing public. A formal notification. Nancy Pelosi was not to present herself for Holy Communion anywhere in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, and if she did present herself, she was not to be admitted. Now I want you to understand the size of that, because if you are not Catholic, or if you are Catholic but this is not your corner of the world, it is easy to hear it as a political stunt. It was not a political stunt. Under canon law, a bishop is the one who governs the sacraments in his own territory. That is his job, not a gesture. And the law contains a provision, Canon 915, about persisting obstinately in grave sin and being admitted to communion. American bishops had argued about that canon for 2 decades. Conferences, working groups, documents, votes, more documents. What almost none of them had done was apply it to a named, living, powerful person and sign their name at the bottom. And I have to give you the 18 years that came before that morning, because without them, you will think Cordileone invented this, and he did not. Go back to 2004. The prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at that time was a German cardinal named Joseph Ratzinger, who 4 years later would be Pope Benedict XVI, and who is going to walk back into this story before we are finished. In the middle of an American election year, with the same argument raging that would rage again in 2022, Ratzinger wrote a short private memorandum for the bishops of the United States. It was titled, "Worthiness to Receive Holy Communion, General Principles." It was 6 paragraphs, and it said in language that leaves very little room to move that a Catholic politician who consistently campaigns for permissive abortion laws, after he has been met with and instructed and warned, and after he persists, must not be admitted, not should consider, not is encouraged to reflect, must not be admitted. That memorandum was sent to the president of the American Bishops' Conference and to Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, then Archbishop of Washington, a man the Church itself would later remove from the priesthood entirely. And what the American bishops heard at their meeting was a summary, a characterization of the memo rather than the memo. The bishops were told that there was a legitimate diversity of opinion on the question, and that the matter was best left to individual bishops with their own consciences. Then, 3 weeks later, the actual text leaked to an Italian journalist, and the bishops of the United States discovered that the document they had been summarized was rather more direct than the summary had suggested. I am not going to build a conspiracy for you out of that because I do not need to. The plain facts are damaging enough, and they are on the record. What I want you to take from it is this. When Salvatore Cordileone signed that notification in May of 2022, he was not inventing a new severity. He was doing the thing that Rome had told the American bishops to do in 2004, in writing, and that the American bishops had spent 18 years finding reasons not to do. And the reasons were not always cowardice. Some of them were serious. There were bishops who argued honestly that turning the communion rail into a checkpoint would do more damage to the Eucharist than any politician could. There were bishops who worried it would make the Church a wing of a political party, which is a fear I share and have always shared. Those were real arguments made by serious men. But the arguing went on for 18 years, and it went on through conference votes and working groups and a document on Eucharistic coherence in 2021 that was debated for months and ended up saying, in the end, almost nothing about the actual question. 18 years of process. And then one archbishop in California stopped processing. Cordileone did. And the reaction was exactly what you would expect and then somewhat worse. He became, more or less overnight, one of the most polarizing figures in American Catholicism. To one half of the country, he was the only bishop in America with a spine. To the other half, he was a culture warrior, weaponizing the Eucharist against a woman who had spent her life in public service. Both of those descriptions were written about the same man in the same week. He was denounced from pulpits and defended from pulpits. Other American bishops were asked, one by one, whether they would do the same in their dioceses. And the great majority of them found ways to say no without quite saying no. And through all of it, there was one voice that did not speak: Rome. Because that is the question that was actually hanging over the whole thing, and everybody in the Church knew it. Not what San Francisco thought. What Rome thought. A bishop had used his authority in the hardest possible case, in the most public possible way, against the third most powerful official in the United States government. Would the Vatican back him, correct him, or leave him standing out there on his own? For 5 weeks, nothing. And then, on the 29th of June, Nancy Pelosi got on a plane to Rome. What happened over the next few hours has been misreported so many times that I am going to slow down and do it properly, including the part that the people who agree with me usually get wrong. Because if I tell you the loud version of what happened in St. Peter's that morning, I will get more of your applause and less of your trust, and I would rather have your trust for the next 40 minutes. The 29th of June is the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. In Rome, it is not an ordinary day. It is the patronal feast of the city itself, the day the Pope traditionally blesses the pallium for the new metropolitan archbishops of the world, and St. Peter's Basilica is full. That morning, Nancy Pelosi was there. Earlier, she had met Pope Francis. The Vatican confirmed the meeting. There was a photograph. And then she attended the Mass, and at the Mass, she received Holy Communion. 5 weeks and change after the Archbishop of San Francisco had signed a public notification saying she must not be admitted to it. Now here is the part I promised to do carefully. It is not true that Pope Francis gave Nancy Pelosi communion. I have heard that sentence said out loud on Catholic television. I have seen it printed, and it is wrong. At a papal Mass of that kind, the Pope does not distribute communion himself. He has not for years. The distribution is done by priests and deacons throughout the basilica, and Pelosi received from one of them, a priest who almost certainly had no idea who was standing in front of him, and no authority over the question either way. Reuters reported that distinction at the time. The fact-checkers went over it afterwards. It is a real distinction, and it matters, and I am telling it to you straight because I would rather you heard the accurate version from me than the exciting version from somebody else. But now let me tell you why the distinction, however true it is, did not change one single thing about what that morning meant. Because the Church does not run on technicalities, it runs on signals. And every bishop on earth reads them the same way. Here is what they saw. A Catholic bishop had formally, publicly, in writing, declared that a named person must not be admitted to communion. 5 weeks later, that person was in the Pope's own basilica, at the Pope's own Mass, on the Feast of the Apostle whose chair the Pope sits in, having just come from a private audience with the Pope, and she received. Nobody stopped her. Nobody had to stop her. And there is a detail about that particular morning that I did not notice myself for a long time, and that I have not seen anybody make anything of, and it has stayed with me since. The 29th of June is the day the pallium is blessed. The pallium is that narrow band of white wool that a metropolitan archbishop wears across his shoulders, and it is given to the new metropolitans of the world by the Pope on that feast, in that basilica. It is the sign of the bond between an archbishop and the See of Peter. It is, quite literally, the Church's symbol for a man being joined to Rome. Salvatore Cordileone is a metropolitan archbishop. He received his pallium in St. Peter's on the 29th of June from a pope in exactly that ceremony, years before any of this happened. So, when I picture that morning in 2022, I am not picturing a courtroom drama. I am picturing a basilica full of new archbishops receiving the sign of their communion with Rome on the anniversary of the day Cordileone received his, while the woman he had barred from communion received it a few yards away, and Rome said nothing at all. I am not going to tell you that was intended. I am certain it was not. Nobody plans a coincidence like that. The calendar simply does what the calendar does. But it happened, and it is the kind of thing that a man notices about his own life for a very long time afterwards. There was no correction of Cordileone from Rome, and there was no confirmation of Cordileone from Rome. There was simply a morning in St. Peter's in which his notification quietly did not exist. And silence in an institution this old is not the absence of an answer. Silence is an answer. Everybody in the room understood which one. And I want to be honest with you about something here, and I am going to label it because I think you should always know when a priest has stopped reporting and started opining. This next part is me. It is not the record. I do not believe that anybody in Rome sat down that June and drew up a plan to humiliate the Archbishop of San Francisco. I have never believed that. I think what actually happened is far more ordinary and, frankly, far more familiar to anyone who has worked inside an institution. I think Rome decided not to decide. I think the calculation was that any statement at all, in either direction, would cost more than saying nothing, and so nothing was said, and a man was left standing in the open. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how large organizations handle a problem they would prefer to outlive. But you should understand what it cost the man standing in the open. And you can measure it because the newspapers measured it for us. That summer, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a piece noting that in the aftermath of the communion denial, Pope Francis had elevated a bishop widely described as progressive. Read the message being taken from that. Whether or not it was the message being sent, that is the message that was received. And it was received by every bishop in America who was quietly wondering whether it was safe to do what Cordileone had done. It was not safe. That was the lesson, and it was learned. Now hold that, because I want to give you the number that this whole story turns on, and then I am going to leave 2022 behind for a while. 4 years. From the summer of 2022 to the summer of 2026, Salvatore Cordileone remained the Archbishop of San Francisco and nothing else. No red hat, no Roman appointment, no public word of support, and no public word of censure. He kept his diocese, he kept his position on the question, and Rome kept its silence. 4 years is a long time in a man's life, and I want to tell you what he did with them because it is not what you would guess from the headlines. He did not spend 4 years fighting about communion. He went back to the thing he had been quietly building since the year after he arrived in San Francisco, which is an institute for sacred music. That is not a joke, and it is not a change of subject. In 2013, Cordileone founded an institute in his archdiocese for sacred music and divine worship, for training church musicians and helping parishes sing the liturgy properly. Choirs, chant, composers, ordinary, slow, unglamorous work that produces no headlines whatsoever, and he has kept at it for over a decade. Remember that, because it is going to come back at the very end of this, and when it does, it is going to tell you something about this Pope that the bulletin did not. It is long enough to conclude, reasonably, that the decision has been made about you and that nobody intends to say it to your face. And then, on the 25th of July, 2026, a different pope put his name on a bulletin. That is the first thing I promised you, and I have now given it to you. Cordileone warned her in April, wrote it publicly in May, watched Rome say nothing in June, and waited 4 years. Now a pope has answered. That is the story America is telling, and every word of it is true. And here is where I have to be a priest with you rather than a newsreader, because if I stop here, I will have done what everybody else did. And I told you at the top that I was not going to do that. There is a detail about Salvatore Cordileone that almost none of the American coverage mentioned, and it is the detail that makes the whole appointment make sense. He is not primarily a culture warrior. That is what he became famous as. It is not what he is. Salvatore Cordileone is a canon lawyer. That is his training. That is his formation. That is the discipline he was shaped by long before anyone outside California knew his name. And in the 1990s, years before he was a bishop of anywhere, before San Francisco, before Oakland, before any of it, he worked as an official inside the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. Inside it, as a member of staff. Sit with that for a second, because it changes the shape of what happened last month. This was not a pope reaching into American politics and pulling out a symbol and putting the symbol on a court. This was a canonist going back to the building where he started, 30 years later, and going back to it as a judge instead of as an employee. That is a different story than the one you have been told. It is a smaller story in one way, because it means the appointment is not primarily a message about Nancy Pelosi. And it is a much bigger story in another. Because if Leo XIV was choosing for competence rather than for symbolism, then the other 6 names on that bulletin were chosen the same way. And that is where this stops being about America. Because I have looked at those other 6 names, and one of them should not legally have been possible until 18 years ago, and should not have happened at all under the last 2 popes. It did not happen under the last 2 popes, and I want to show you the door they walked past. Before I open that door, you need to know what room it opens into. And I am willing to bet almost anything that you do not know, because most Catholics do not. And I say that without a shred of superiority, because for a long stretch of my own priesthood, I did not either. The Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. Even the name sounds like something behind glass in a museum. Let me tell you what it actually is and what it actually does in plain English, because in about 10 minutes it is going to matter enormously. The Catholic Church is a legal system. I know that is not the first thing you think of when you think of the Church, and I am glad it is not, because it should not be the first thing. But it is true, and it has been true for the better part of 2,000 years. There is a body of law. There are courts. There are judges, appeals, procedures, deadlines, rights of defense. When a marriage case is heard, that is a court. When a priest is removed, that is a legal act with a legal standard, and it can be appealed. And at the very top of that entire structure, above every diocesan tribunal in every country on earth, above the Roman rota, sits the Apostolic Signatura. It is the highest court in the Catholic Church. The only authority above it is the Pope. Now, what does it do? 3 things, and I want you to hear the third one especially. First, it judges complaints of nullity brought against judgments of the Roman Rota. In other words, it is the court that reviews whether the second highest court got it wrong. Second, it resolves conflicts of jurisdiction between tribunals, which sounds dry until you realize it means it is the body that decides which court a person's case even belongs to, and therefore whether a person gets heard at all. And third, this is the one. As what canon law calls a contentious administrative tribunal, it hears appeals against singular administrative acts of the dicasteries of the Roman Curia, on the grounds that the law was violated either in the decision itself or in the procedure that produced it. Let me say that again in the language of a parish rather than the language of a canonist. It is the court where you appeal against the Vatican, not against your bishop, against a department of the Holy See itself. If one of the great Roman offices makes a decision about you, and that decision broke the Church's own law, or was arrived at by a process that broke the Church's own law, the Apostolic Signatura is the place, and in practice very nearly the only place, where that can be said out loud and where you can win. It is the room where the institution can be told that it did not follow its own rules. And now let me tell you why you have never heard of it, because the reason is not that it is secret. The Apostolic Signatura is not hidden. It has an address in the Palazzo della Cancelleria in Rome, one of the great Renaissance palaces of the city, and it has a prefect, and it publishes, and canon lawyers write books about it that other canon lawyers read. It is invisible for a much more ordinary reason. It is invisible because it is boring, and because it is slow, and because almost nothing that happens there can be photographed. A tribunal that hears administrative appeals against curial decrees produces no images. There is no verdict read out to a crowd. There is a decree, in Latin, months or years later, and it is sent to the parties, and that is the end of it. Compare that with a pope washing feet, or a cardinal resigning, or a bishop denying communion to a Speaker of the House. Those things have pictures. This does not. So the part of the Catholic Church that exists to hold the Catholic Church to its own law is the one part of it that never appears on your screen. And the parts that appear on your screen constantly are the parts where the law is not really the question at all. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment because it is not only true of the Church, it is true of almost every institution any of us has ever dealt with. The oversight is real, and the oversight is dull, and dull things do not travel. Now I'm going to stop being a reporter for a minute, and I hope you will let me, because we have arrived at the part of this story where I cannot pretend to be neutral, and I do not think you would want me to be. I told you at the beginning that in the middle of my 30 years, I named something that was being quietly buried, and that the response was to make me the problem. I have said that much on this channel before. What I have not said, and what I want to say now because this particular story dragged it back up out of me, is what I did next. Which was nothing. I did not appeal. I did not write to anyone in Rome. I did not so much as ask whether there was a procedure, whether there was a form, whether there was a court, whether there was anywhere at all above the men in that room who had just decided what my life was going to look like. And the reason I did not is not that I was brave enough to accept it or humble enough to offer it up. The reason is that it genuinely did not occur to me that such a place existed. I was a parish priest on the south side of Chicago. I knew how to bury the dead and how to talk a man out of a bottle, and how to keep a boiler running one more winter. I did not know that there was a tribunal in Rome whose entire purpose was to hear a man say the department was wrong. Nobody had ever told me. And I should say plainly who can actually go there because I do not want to have raised your hopes about a court you cannot reach. You do not walk into the Apostolic Signatura. In the ordinary run of things, you need an advocate, a canon lawyer admitted to practice before that tribunal, and there are not many of them, and they are concentrated in Rome. There are deadlines measured in days that most people do not know are running until they have already run out. This is not a small claims court. It is a Supreme Court, with everything that implies about cost and delay and expertise, and any priest who tells you otherwise is selling you something. And I want to be careful here because I can hear how this sounds. I am not standing here telling you that if I had known about the Apostolic Signatura, my life would have gone differently. Honestly, I doubt it. Most cases that go there do not succeed. The process is slow. It is in Latin and Italian. It costs money, and a man in my position in those years would have needed a canon lawyer he could not afford to even begin. I am not telling you I was robbed of a victory. I am telling you something smaller and I think sadder. I did not know the door was there. And there is a particular kind of powerlessness that comes not from losing a fight, but from never having understood that a fight was available to you. That is why I care about this story. Not because of Nancy Pelosi, not because of American politics, which I have very little appetite for, and which will still be exactly as loud tomorrow as it is today. I care because the Apostolic Signatura is the part of the Catholic Church that exists to make the Catholic Church answerable to its own law. And almost nobody in the pews has ever heard of it, and Pope Leo XIV just rebuilt it. And here is the promise I made you at the top, arriving now, right on schedule. I told you there was a name on that list that changes more than Cordileone's. Here is why there had to be one. For the entire history of that tribunal, sitting on it meant one thing above all else. You had to be a bishop, or a cardinal. The men who judged at the summit of the church were the men who held the rank. That was not an accident, and it was not a prejudice. It came out of a real theological instinct, that authority in the church is bound up with the office of the bishop, and that judging in the name of the church is an exercise of that authority. You can argue with that instinct. Popes have, but it held. And it meant that the Church's Supreme Court was, always and by definition, composed of men who had been chosen for something other than their skill in law. Some of them were superb canonists. Cordileone, as it happens, genuinely is one. But that was a happy coincidence of the appointment, not the point of it. The rank came first. The competence came along, if it came at all. 18 years ago, a pope decided that was a problem, and he did something about it. He wrote the fix into the law of the church. He signed it. He promulgated it. And then neither he nor the man who followed him ever used it. Not once. Not in 18 years. Let me tell you what he wrote. The 21st of June, 2008, Pope Benedict XVI signs an apostolic letter issued motu proprio, which means on his own initiative. Nobody asked him for it. It is called Antiqua Ordinatione. By it, he promulgates the lex propria, the proper law, of the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. Understand what that is. That is the constitution of the Church's highest court. The document that says what it is, who sits on it, how it works, what it may and may not do. And it had not been rewritten in 40 years. The norms that governed the Signatura until that morning dated from 1968, out of the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, out of a church that in 1968 was still trying to work out what it had just done to itself. 40 years is a long time to run a Supreme Court on a document nobody has revisited. And you should know what those 40 years had done to the thing. The 1968 norms were written for a church that had just come out of a council and did not yet know what it had become. In the 4 decades that followed, the volume and the character of what arrived at that tribunal changed completely. Marriage cases multiplied across the world by orders of magnitude. Whole categories of dispute appeared that had barely existed before, particularly in the administrative field, as the Roman Curia was reorganized twice and began issuing decisions that touched people's lives far more directly than it once had. The court was running 21st century traffic on 1968 rails. Anybody inside it knew that. It had been discussed for years. What it took was a pope who happened to be, by formation and by instinct, exactly the kind of man who reads a procedural law for pleasure. Benedict revisited it. And tucked inside that new law is a provision that, at the time, drew almost no attention whatsoever. I have gone back and looked. It was not the headline in 2008. It was not the second paragraph. It was barely reported. The provision says that certain clerics of good reputation, doctors in canon law, endowed with outstanding canonical knowledge, may be included among the members of the tribunal. Read it again slowly, because the words are doing a great deal of work. Clerics, not bishops. A cleric is any ordained man. A parish priest is a cleric. Doctors in canon law, not men of rank, men of qualification. Endowed with outstanding canonical knowledge. Not distinguished in service, not senior in years, not owed a favor. Knowledge. Benedict XVI in 2008 quietly wrote into the Constitution of the Church's Supreme Court that you no longer had to be a bishop to judge there. You had to be good at it. And I should be precise about what being a member of that tribunal actually means, because the word is doing more work than it looks like it is doing. A member is not an advisor. A member is not an honorary title you hang on a wall next to the photograph of your ordination. The heaviest matters that come to the Apostolic Signatura are not decided by one man alone at a desk. They are decided collegially by the members, sitting together, discussing the case, and then voting on it. So when Benedict wrote that certain priests, doctors in canon law of outstanding knowledge, could be included among the members, he was not writing a courtesy. He was writing that a man who is not a bishop could sit in that room and cast a vote on whether a department of the Roman Curia had broken the law of the Church. That is what the provision means in practice. That is what went unused for 18 years. And then he never did it. That is the part that stops me every time I read it, and I have read it several times now trying to make it mean something else. Benedict promulgated that law in June of 2008, and he reigned for another 4 years and 8 months. He was, of all the popes of my lifetime, the one most at home in exactly this world. A professor. A man whose instinct was always for the person who actually knew the subject over the person who merely held the position. He wrote the door into the wall himself, and in 4 years and 8 months, he never once walked through it. Then Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis and reigned for 12 years. 12 years of appointments to that tribunal. 12 years of a pontificate whose entire public grammar was about flattening hierarchy, about the shepherd who smells of the sheep, about a church that is not a pyramid. 12 years, and the seats on the Apostolic Signatura went to bishops and cardinals, every single time. The provision sat in the law, fully valid, fully available, requiring no further permission from anyone, and it went unused. 18 years, 2 popes. One of them wrote it, and one of them preached something very close to it, and neither of them touched it. Now, I want to be fair to both of those men, because it would be extremely cheap of me to stand here and imply that they were cowards or hypocrites, and I do not believe either thing. There are perfectly serious reasons why a pope hesitates. Putting a priest as a full member on a tribunal alongside cardinals raises real questions about how authority works in the Church, and those questions do not have obvious answers. A pope who leaves a provision unused is not necessarily ignoring it. He may be waiting for the right man, or the right moment, or simply concluding that it is not worth the fight this year, and then not next year either. I understand that. I have done a version of it myself, on a scale of no importance to anyone but me. There was a change I wanted to make in a parish once, a small one, and I had the authority to make it, and I sat on that authority for the better part of 3 years, telling myself I was waiting for the right time. I was not waiting for the right time. I was avoiding the argument. I found that out about myself later than I would like to admit. And I will go one further, because I think this is the honest version, and the honest version is usually more useful. I do not actually know that Leo XIV was braver than the 2 men before him. That is the easy reading, and I distrust it. It may simply be that he arrived at a moment when the argument had already been had, quietly, for 18 years, by canon lawyers nobody interviews, and that what looks like a decisive act was really the last small step of a very long and very boring process that other men carried most of the way. That happens far more often than the dramatic version. Most change in this church is not a pope deciding something on a Tuesday. It is 40 years of somebody's unread footnotes, and then a signature. What I can say for certain is that the signature is his. 2 other men could have signed it and did not, for 18 years between them, and he did, in his first year and a half. Whatever the reason, the door that had been standing open since 2008 was walked through by the 3rd man to look at it. So when I look at 18 years of an open door and 2 popes who did not go through it, I do not feel superior. I recognize something. On the 25th of July, 2026, Pope Leo XIV walked through it. 3 of the 7 names on that bulletin are not bishops. They are priests. For the first time in the entire history of the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura, men who are not bishops sit as full members of the highest court in the Catholic Church. That is the 3rd thing I promised you at the beginning, and there it is. Not a promotion, A precedent. Because here is what a precedent does, and this is why I told you the name that matters is not Cordileone's. An appointment ends. Every one of those 7 men has a 5-year term. In 2031, they come up for renewal, and some of them will not be renewed, and the world will keep turning. Cordileone's appointment is news for a week and a footnote in a biography. But the first time a rule is used, the rule stops being theoretical. From the 25th of July of this year, it is simply a fact about the Catholic Church that a priest who is not a bishop can be a judge on its supreme tribunal, because 3 of them are. Nobody has to be talked into it anymore. It has been done. And every pope who comes after Leo will make his appointments in a church where that is normal. There is a passage I keep thinking about, and it is not one I would have expected. It is in the 18th chapter of Exodus. Moses is sitting from morning to evening judging the people. Every dispute, one man doing all of it. And his father-in-law Jethro watches him do it for a full day and then tells him the truth. You are not able to do this alone. You will wear yourself out and these people with you. And Jethro's instruction is very specific about what to look for in the men who will share the burden. Able men, capable men, men of truth. He does not say important men, he says able. 3,000 years later, a pope read a provision about outstanding canonical knowledge and used it. So who are they? Because I have been calling them the 3 priests for 10 minutes now, and they have names. Father Eduardo Baura de la Peña, a Spaniard, professor of canon law at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. Father Ulrich Rode, a German, a Jesuit, professor of canon law at the Pontifical Gregorian University. And Monsignor Gianpaolo Montini, an Italian, an emeritus professor of canon law and one of the leading specialists alive in the procedural law of exactly this tribunal. Look at what those 3 men have in common, because it is the whole point. Not one of them governs anything. None of them has a diocese, a flock, a cathedral, a budget, a chancery. They have no rank to bring into that room. What they have is that they know the law better than almost anyone on earth. And I want to slow down on Father Ulrich Rode for a second, because there is something in that appointment that I suspect Leo XIV understood perfectly well. Rode is a Jesuit. The last pope was a Jesuit, the first in the history of the Church, and in 12 years he did not put a priest of any order on that tribunal. The provision was there. He did not use it. And now the pope who does use it is an Augustinian, and one of the 3 men he chooses is a Jesuit professor from the Gregorian, which is the Jesuit University in Rome, the house that has trained a very large share of the Church's senior men for 400 years. I am not suggesting there is a message coded in that for anybody. I doubt there is. I mention it because it is a small illustration of something true about this whole story, which is that the men who talk the most about flattening a hierarchy are not reliably the men who flatten it. And the man who finally did it said nothing about it at all. Montini, in particular, has spent a career on the procedure of the Signatura itself, which means Pope Leo XIV has put on the court a man whose life's work is the study of how that court is supposed to operate. And that tells you something about what Leo thinks this tribunal is for. You do not appoint a procedural specialist to a body you intend to use as a rubber stamp. You appoint a procedural specialist when you intend for the procedure to be followed. And there is a 4th man, who is a bishop, and whose appointment, I would argue, is the quietest and the heaviest of all 7. Bishop Juan Ignacio Arrieta Ochoa de Chinchetru. Until June of this year, he was the secretary of the Dicastery for Legislative Texts. Now, that department does not make headlines, and it should. Legislative Texts is the office that gives the authentic interpretation of canon law. When there is a dispute about what a canon actually means, when a bishop's conference needs to know whether a proposed norm is compatible with universal law, when the Church has to decide what its own words oblige, that is the desk it lands on. Arrieta sat at that desk. He is regarded, without much argument from anybody, as one of the foremost canon lawyers in the Vatican. He spent years telling the Church what its law means. And in June, he left that post. And in July, the Pope made him a judge on the court that decides whether the Church obeyed it. From writing the law to judging it. I do not think you can read that as a retirement. Then there are the 2 Americans, because there are 2, and only one of them got any coverage at all. Alongside Cordileone, Pope Leo appointed Bishop Edward Losa of Kalamazoo, Michigan. And Losa is worth 30 seconds of your time precisely because he is not famous. He was ordained for the Diocese of Erie in 1989. He holds a doctorate in canon law from the Gregorian. He worked inside the Vatican at the Congregation for the Clergy from 2010 to 2015. He became a bishop in 2023. He has, as far as I can find, never said a controversial word in public in his life. He is on that court for one reason, and it is the same reason as the three professors. He knows the law. 2 American bishops were appointed to the Church's Supreme Tribunal on the same day. One of them is a household name because of a fight about communion. The other is a canon lawyer from Michigan. The American press reported one of them. And the 7th is Bishop Krzysztof Nitkevich of Sandomierz in Poland, who carries into that room the perspective of a church that spent 2 generations learning what happens to people when the law is whatever the powerful say it is that morning. 7 men, 5-year terms. 2 Americans, a Pole, a Spaniard, a German, and 2 Italians, if we count Arrieta by his post rather than his birth, and he is in fact a Spaniard too, so make that 2 Spaniards and 1 Italian. Lawyers, nearly all of them, by training and by temperament. Now let me be straight with you about the edge of what I know, because I would rather tell you where my information stops than pretend it does not. There is one part of this story I could not get. When 7 new members are named to a 5-year term, it is because 7 terms ended. Somebody left that court. The Catholic press in Rome has reported on who is no longer there and what that means, and I could not get behind it, and I am not going to guess at names in order to fill a gap in front of you. If it turns out to matter, I will come back and tell you. What I can tell you is what the shape of this means, and I will label it clearly, because this is my reading and not the bulletin. I think Pope Leo XIV has told us something about how he intends to govern, and he has told us in the most Roman way possible, which is to say without a single sentence of explanation. He did not give a speech about competence. He did not publish a document about the role of the laity and the lower clergy in the exercise of judicial authority. He put 7 names on a bulletin on a Friday in July, and 3 of them were men who could not have sat there under any pope before Benedict, and did not sit there under Benedict, and did not sit there under Francis. If you want to know what a pope believes, do not read what he says about how the church should be run. Watch who he lets into the room. And I want to bring this all the way back to you now, because I did not spend 40 minutes on canon law for the pleasure of it. Most of us will never file a case with the Apostolic Signatura. I certainly never did. But every one of us has been on the wrong end of an institution at some point, and I include this one. And I include myself in the list of people who have been on the wrong end of it. And what you learn in that situation, if you learn anything, is that the question is never really whether the institution has rules. Everything has rules. The question is whether anyone with the competence to apply them is ever going to be in the room. That is what changed last month. Not a great deal, I grant you. 3 professors on a court most Catholics have never heard of. But it changed in the right direction, and it changed after 18 years of nothing, and it changed because a pope looked at a provision that 2 better-known men had left alone and decided that this was the year. America is going to remember this week as the week the pope backed the archbishop who took on Nancy Pelosi. Fine, he did. But the thing that will still be true about the Catholic Church in 50 years is not Coeur d'Leone. It is that the door is open now, and it was opened by a pope who never explained himself. In a bulletin, nobody read to the bottom. And now let me give you the thing I told you to hold on to, back when I mentioned an Institute for Sacred Music, because I have been waiting the whole hour to close this circle, and it closes on a name. Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. Count how many times that one man has walked through this story tonight without ever being the subject of it. It was Ratzinger who wrote the memorandum in 2004 that said a politician who persists must not be admitted, the instruction the American bishops argued about for 18 years, and that Coeur d'Leone finally carried out. It was Benedict who, 4 years after that, wrote the law that made it possible for a priest, who is not a bishop, to judge on the Church's Supreme Tribunal, and then left it sitting there. And the institute that Coeur d'Leone founded in San Francisco and has quietly run for over a decade is named, of all the names available to him, the Benedict XVI Institute. 3 threads, 1 man, and he is not alive to see any of it come together. I find that genuinely moving, and I am aware that is a strange thing for a priest from the south side of Chicago to find moving, but there it is. A man writes things down. He does not get to see them used. Somebody uses them 18 years later and never mentions his name in the announcement. I have spent a lot of my life being told that the way things are is simply the way things are. It was not true. It took 18 years and it took a third pope, but it was not true. Hold on to that one, family. It is worth more than the headline. God bless you, and I love you.